Welcome to Windows on the World, bringing you cutting-edge news, empowering information and no conspiracy theories on People's Internet Radio. Tonight we're going to have a look at the bigger picture of how things are being enforced on us. I talk about this a lot. It's known as Agenda 21 or Agenda 2030. I do tend to focus on this because of its importance in every aspect of people's daily lives. I've just been observing how this has been played out in London, for instance, with so-called mini Holland schemes, which are being implemented really by Transport for London. But it's not Transport for London. It's not their policy. The money's coming through Transport for London. So people are being misled with this agenda, and they're being told it's about cycling and fluffy things like green issues, when, of course, a lot of the people who listen to People's Internet Radio will know that this is not the case. I've got a guest tonight who we've had many interesting conversations in the past. His name is David Howard, and we've covered how these issues are global issues, this Agenda 21, this United Nations world government that's being formed, how it's being played out in your local community, because this is where it gets important. It's important for people to see in a micro level how things are actually happening around them, because otherwise they think it's some far off thing. Oh, it's the United Nations, that distant body. Well, the distant body called the United Nations is implementing these policies through your local council, through global action plans, which were agreed by your local council 15 years ago. And there's many people who listen to People's Internet Radio who go, oh, the council, well, you know, I'll deal with them. But it's not quite as simple as that when it gets to these green policies, because they're being implemented into every walk of life, and they're taking away all of your rights, really, including the right to travel, property rights, and basically just freedom of movement. And we see this being played out. We see things like the ticket office closing, you know, your railway station. They closed all the ticket offices. We had Steve Headley of the RMT union talking about this. The reason is it's about centralisation of power, about taking away your ability to be anonymous so that they get straight into your bank account. It's all contactless. And this is a big part of the Agenda 21 policies, like the sustainable development housing, where you actually have to have ID to get into your own front door. And that's all coming, and it's being played out in many cities up and down the country, mainly London. But this will be happening in Manchester and Birmingham and Liverpool, all these Agenda 21 super cities that are being formed. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce David Howard. David, welcome to Windows on the World.
Thank you, Mark. Hello. Good to be on the radio.
Well, it's good to be anywhere these days, isn't it, David?
It is, yeah. All we need is our freedom. Everything else comes second. Our health and our freedom. That's the two keys to life, to happiness.
Indeed. And of course, one of the great icons of our childhoods really died this week. David Bowie at 69. Young, really.
Yeah, it was a shame. Of course, nobody knew he had cancer except those close to him. It would have been better prepared, I think, if people knew, but he didn't want that. But he worked right to the end and left his legacy. So he carried on, and he's done a great job. And it'll go down in memory. My teenage years, part of the background music all the time.
Well, that's right. Yeah, it's very interesting how everything seems to be changing, you know, like culturally, you know, we're finding that cultural landmarks are being removed everywhere. And this is a big part of what we're going to talk about tonight, this homogenization of culture, which I've seen happening in the entertainment area for years now. It's not just the X Factor, that's a big part of it, karaoke culture and all the rest of it, but it's about the diminishing of the importance of culture and you know, people's individuality.
Yeah, well, there's this huge thing that the left have about equality. Now, what they get wrong about equality is that all our lives are equal. I mean, I believe all animal lives are equal as well, unless you have to eat them. That's part of nature. But everybody's right to life and right to speak and right to have a fair trial is equal, but every person is different and unique. And you look at the genome, all those little barcodes on the genes, no two can ever be the same, even identical twins. And we were designed to be different so that we can all do different things and help each other and work as a team. We'll never be the same, and that's the huge mistake the left make.
It's very interesting you say that, and actually it's this left-right thing is quite interesting. They call it the left-right paradigm, as though there is actually any difference now between these major parties. I think with Corbyn coming in, it has changed things quite a bit. I don't think they were expecting, they played every dirty trick they could think of against him. But I think some of this so-called consensus politics is slightly falling apart now. What do you think about that?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Tony Blair basically put power ahead of principles, because what you had till Tony Blair came along was a serious right and left wing choice, and the Liberal Democrats, if you didn't like either of them, and that's how it was for 100 years really, as soon as the Labour movement began in the early 20th century, and Blair came along and wiped all that out with a stroke, and it was impossible literally to tell the difference between all their policies. And then when we had Maastricht and Lisbon Treaty, the EU took away most of our serious policies, so there wasn't actually a huge amount of power now that the government has. And at least Jeremy Corbyn has brought back a serious left wing now. I'm not saying I like either of them, but the great thing is now people have got a proper choice, and it's up to them. And if they don't want the left wing, at least they know that they will be rejecting the left wing, but there was that option.
Well, that's absolutely right. I think it has thrown a spanner in the works of consensus politics, as I've just said. In fact, that's what Piers Corbyn, his brother, said. I was there when Jeremy Corbyn got elected, and it was very refreshing in a way, because the mainstream media turned up, but were not allowed into the pub where Jeremy and the Labour Party supporters were. They didn't want them to spoil the day. They had the alternative media in there, all having a few pints, and Jeremy Corbyn making a speech. But they didn't want the mainstream media in there, which I thought was very interesting. And it shows that Corbyn's onto them, and they know it. He's very experienced in that respect, because he's been doing this from the sidelines for so many years.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same in America with Donald Trump. I mean, again, like him or hate him, at least he is standing up for free speech, and he is putting into words the opinions that many people in Britain feel that they can't say in public because they might get a knock on the door. Now, it's very insidious, because there's a huge difference between inciting crime, which is already a crime, by speech, and just disagreeing. I saw a programme about Islam, Reggie Yates, I think, where they said that in America you can be as racist as you like. I'm not saying racism is a good thing, but they were being racist because the Constitution allows them to say anything that isn't illegal, and we don't have that in Britain. And if they're going to start cracking down on hate speech and causing offence, guess what, 99% of any criticism you make against anyone except your own people might become illegal. And if they can stop thinking
Yeah, because I covered the Counter-Terrorism and Security Act, which came in 2015, and a lot of this stuff revolves around that, with local authorities being given a statutory duty to identify people in the community vulnerable to terrorism or extremism, whatever extremism may be. And I think within Waltham Forest, where the borough, which I spent a lot of time uncovering what they were up to, any form of extremism they would recognise would be, say, opposing the council. That would be an extreme thing to do, and so according to them, I would be an extremist. So what they've done is they've taken on this kind of responsibility to form panels of people in the local authority. Now, I can't think of anybody less competent than a local authority to deal with stuff like that, but they're instructed by the police, and then they have to put these people in front of a panel and assess them. And if you're deemed to be socially unacceptable or even mentally deficient by their standards, they can bring in healthcare professionals, which may not even be doctors, you know.
Well, that's exactly what happened in the Soviet Union. I mean, I remember in the 80s, during the Cold War, you know, we were terrified of the poor Russians having to live under the exact same system that we got rid of. And all that's happened is, once the Berlin Wall fell down and all the gulags and the Siberian so-called mental institutions and retraining, re-education officially ended in the Soviet Union and just came over to Europe. And now we're going to get all the things that we hated in the 70s and the 80s, and it's going to come over here without people even noticing it, unless they listen to us.
Well, this is really where it's all going. A lot of people don't realise that Britain actually is a communist country in many respects. You know, you find this kind of willful ignorance that people will say, well, this is Britain. And they seem to have missed something in the last 20 years, you know. They seem to have, like, it's almost like they are in denial about it. And I think this is the problem with, especially people who consider themselves to be part of the political, you know, basically the people who deem themselves to be political and influential are incredibly naive to what's going on. You know, they might wear their Knights of Malta badges, go to these dinners and do a bit of charity work and be very informed on certain levels. This is one thing I've found, very informed about, you know, constitutional aspects of things, and they're genuinely up in arms. They go, no, of course this is Britain, we have rights, and all of the stuff that we're going to talk about tonight seems to have bypassed them. I think that's very dangerous, you know.
Yeah, well, what I've found is that it's a delay system. What's happened is on the internet or in the little local community which knows about these things, we've known about really serious issues like FGM and that type of thing, and some good policies such as the basic income. And, you know, occasionally people will mention it in the media and get, what's that? You know, oh, that's not real, that doesn't happen, oh, don't worry about that. Or you're mad, depending on what particular unusual thing, or climate adjustments is another one. And then the media finally pick it up after a year or two or three, and suddenly it becomes news. And I mean, they've been talking about this basic income on the news for the last weeks. It's happened in Utrecht, and suddenly everyone's agreeing with it. I rang up the radio 2 years ago and I was called a lunatic. So people do get it eventually. It's just a matter of things maturing. It's like they're growing throughout the winter, and then this shoot comes up through the earth, and you see this big plant coming up, and everyone says, oh yeah, that's not so bad after all, we'll do something about that. So we've got to be patient. We will get there.
Well, hopefully. I've just seen things really accelerate in the past few years, though. Again, stuff that was happening in Waltham Forest, which I covered quite a lot, and now I've got some inside information on that from people who managed to get into these so-called public meetings, which aren't held for the public, they're all held in private. And the stuff that's going on is mirroring exactly these Agenda 21 policies we're going to talk about this evening. So, David, you haven't really introduced yourself yet. Give us your background and really how you got into this, and also you can mention your websites as well.
Okay, well, basically I studied law. I did a law degree and carried on teaching law and politics while I was doing a counselling diploma. So after teaching law in schools for 6 years, I qualified as a counsellor, which I do now. And the thing about legal process is it allows you to look into anything, because what you do is you work with experts. You're not working alone, you're working as a team. And if somebody makes a mistake in any profession, there's a huge difference between creating equations and putting all the data together and presenting it to the public who can actually understand it. So it's a totally different, like uploading and downloading. The uploading is difficult, but the downloading where people actually see it is easy. And I was interested in the news. I got into the supernatural stuff. I used my hypnosis to speak to people who think they've been abducted by aliens and interview them and hypnotise them to get memories back, and do a bit of teaching and meditation, that sort of thing. And I was interested in global warming just because it was unusual. It was some kind of change where, oh, the world's going to be different. And I didn't realise at the time that this global warming was something which was more than a passive observation of something which may or may not have been happening, but they were going to use it to cut down our access to energy and travel and everything else, the things that have created the Industrial Revolution. And I thought, oh, hold on a minute, there's something dodgy here, because a lawyer has a radar, it's like the police, and you start picking up if you're interviewing a suspect and they keep changing their story, you know they're lying. And this is what happened over about 3 years with global warming. All the things they said in the early 90s, by the late 90s, none of it had happened. And by the late 90s, I had the internet, started looking it up, and found that it was all absolute nonsense. And they were using the most basic smoke and mirrors, as Penn and Teller said in their global warming farming destruction when they did a piece on it. It's smoke and mirrors. They're just using old accounting tricks with scientific figures. So when I saw what harm it was causing by cutting old people off from having their heat on in the winter and not allowing my neighbour to take his son to his mother in the congestion charge because they'd used this fake thing to ban cars in London unless you pay more and more, and now they're banning vans. People are suffering. I know 2 people that have lost their vehicles due to the low emission zone, so people are being hurt now. And if you took away that idea that carbon dioxide is a pollutant and it's going to ruin our lives in 2100 when nobody will be alive to know it, there's nothing wrong with fossil fuel, nothing wrong with CO2, and the whole thing's an illusion. And I don't like myself being taken for a ride. I don't like poor innocent other people being taken for a ride. So I feel it's my duty, as someone who's got the time and the training to investigate these things, not to come out and help them and direct them. That's basically the story.
Well, that's very true, and also having a background in law is very useful when we're dealing with this stuff, because we are actually dealing with fraud.
Yeah,
this
exactly.
is actually a fraud that's being played out, and you can call it fraud because it is one, and it's being implemented by people who are not doing it from a scientific point of view. I've been interviewing people who are at the Paris Climate Challenge. You can find that on windowsontheworld.net.
Oh, yeah, some of that, yeah.
Yeah, and so last week I had Niels Axel Morner, who's the world's leading expert on sea levels, and he has got the most amazing information about the setup of the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which was formed really to push this agenda. Now, we're going to get into that a bit later. But first of all, I'd like to go into the environmental movement, because a lot of this came out of the green agenda, the environmental movement of the 60s and 70s, which you know quite a bit about. So give us a bit of a background to how this started from your research, you know.
Well, it's been interesting, because what people don't realise is that the green principles, including the climate, go back to the 1970s and earlier. There was the Endangered Atmosphere Conference in 1974, where people like Margaret Mead, the anthropologist, and Stephen Schneider, one of the earliest people on the IPCC, and one of the top climate alarmists, and as he's dead now, I can be rude about him because you can't lie of all the dead. Everything I'm saying about him is true. If you look up the quotes on that, you will see that they said we have to scare people through any means possible to look after the planet, because basically they saw the planet as being more important than the people, and they were prepared to hurt the people to protect the planet. Now, global warming was picked up by the Club of Rome in 1991. It's published free on their website. You can read the entire book on PDF for nothing. And what they said was that we need to put mankind against each other, and in order to carry out these dreadful policies of restricting access to energy and keeping people cold and in one place, because the 2 major things were taxation and restricting energy and travel. In order to do that, we need to think up a reason for it. Water shortages and global warming were the things they thought up. None of this is a conspiracy, because the entire thing has been spoken about openly by these guys, because half of them actually believe they're right, so they don't think it's necessary to hide their motives. They just say, yeah, well, you know, it's like Hitler said, you know, we're the chosen people, we'll kill all the Untermensch because we're the Übermensch, and you know, there's nothing wrong with that, because they believe they're right. So you need to find the people who believe they're right, see what they say, and you know perfectly well what the truth is because they've said it.
That's exactly right, David. We're just getting a bit of a problem with your sound. It seems to be dipping down a bit. So maybe could you turn your speakers down a bit?
Yep. Yeah, I'm with you.
Turn mine down at this end.
Yeah, okay, done that.
I'm going to ask Tony in the sound booth if that's better. Is that better, Tony?
Shall I say something?
We won't really know until David speaks for a while.
Okay, it sounds better on my end anyway. But yes, that's very interesting how this environmental movement started. And yeah, we've talked about this before.
Yeah.
And the way it's been used. For instance, I met Patrick Moore, who's co-founder of Greenpeace, who does a talk, basically Celebrate CO2. laughing in the face of these assumptions that carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas and we've got to get rid of it. And he did a very detailed presentation on that, and it just took you through how he started as a real environmentalist and how he saw what happened to Greenpeace. It was completely taken over by this political agenda,
Yeah.
which is of course why he resigned from it all.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's the thing. I mean, the very simple facts. This is why I say anybody who's done secondary school maths or arithmetic can work this out for themselves. CO2 itself, if it is a greenhouse gas, it doesn't really matter whether it is or not, because, you know, take the assumption that this is where it matters if you're a scientist or not. I'm not a scientist. It's not my business to claim whether CO2 is a greenhouse gas or not. There's loads of people who do that, and I'll leave it to them. But if it is a greenhouse gas, then what we do know, all straight from the IPCC documents, is that if you double CO2, because it's logarithmic, it becomes less powerful as you increase it, you will add a whole single centigrade to the average world temperature. And the IPCC say that until it reaches 2 centigrade, we're not going to have more problems than we'll have benefits. And they've got a page in, if you look through hundreds of pages tucked away, benefits of warming. Now, the benefits of warming, unlike the problems from warming, are not in models or theories. They are from known history, the Roman and Minoan and medieval warm periods, which until 2001 existed in all history books of these peaks way above where we are now, and they were all wiped out by Michael Mann, who said, right, we'll rewrite history just like the USSR. Everything's going to be flat until 1970 or something, when it all shoots up. And, you know, anybody with the slightest knowledge of statistics and just common sense will see that you can't suddenly change history like that, because all the old books and all the old methods they used are just as good as the methods they're using now. They just weren't as sophisticated, but they're not different enough to say, oh, well, the last 10,000 years history is different. They're going beyond their limits. And there's been no positive feedback. That is my bottom line with the climate. We've had a rise from 45-50% of CO2, and the temperature hasn't gone up enough from CO2 taking away the natural causes to be a problem. We proved it. Case closed.
Very interesting. There was a chap I met there in France called Christian Gerondeau, whose book is called United Nations Climate Liars. And he goes into this in quite some detail of how the IPCC, this Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which we referred to earlier, was set up, and that it is not a scientific body. It has a purely political agenda, and it is not run by scientists. And a lot of the public have a problem with this, because they're told through the BBC that this is science and the science is settled. But the main driving force, which is what they call CO2, it's a question of life or death for the IPCC, CO2. Everything it does is based on the premise that CO2 emissions caused by human activities are leading to climate change. If it were found to be impossible to significantly reduce these emissions, then the IPCC would no longer have any purpose. And this has already been proved, that these targets that they've set are just unrealistic. And according to the International Energy Agency, they are not going to be met anyway. And even if they were met, it wouldn't be making any difference. So this is one of the biggest scandals in our history, because it impacts on every part of our daily life, and it's based on a lie, and it's based on a huge lie. And people are so brainwashed into it. What's very clever about this is how the green movement we've been talking about has been co-opted completely into this on every level. We're not just talking about eco-fascists here and people who were saying that the population needed to be reduced and we were a cancer on the earth. We're not talking about that kind of extremism, but you're talking about these Guardian reading middle classes, really, if that's the right word, who are are so naive to it, and they get militant about it without being able to actually give you any facts.
Well, it's about assumptions. You see, they assume. I mean, there's nothing better than a convert because I'm on loads of groups on Facebook, etc. And what happens is, like Patrick Moore is a perfect example of somebody that used to believe it, and then you suddenly realise they're wrong, because like children, and until they're sort of 12 or 13, they think everyone does things the way their family does, and their parents know everything, and then they start going to other people's houses and finding that their parents got this wrong and that wrong, and so did their teachers, and people go to bed at different times, and everyone does things their own way, and you can't rely on any particular authority. You actually have to work things out yourself as well, because if you go into any scientific community, there's politics involved, and there are what you call accepted views on things like intelligence, race, all these other things where they've got politically correct views. When they had things, for example, in the 50s and 60s that showed different races had different intelligences, and different people had different intelligences, they spent more time trying to hide it than they actually did looking into it to see what it meant for society. And this carries on in science. So when I read all these newspapers and assumed that the scientists were right, because why would they want to lie to it? It just didn't occur to me. And then a few years later, I compared their expectations with the reality. I thought, well, they've got it all wrong. Why have they made a big fuss? Then you see the taxes and the gas bills rising and the roads being cut off, and you start hearing the news about all the Kyoto Protocol. Suddenly it all makes sense. It's their method of getting these policies through, and the global warming was just the way that people would accept it, because it's basically Turkeys voting for Christmas by consent. Without people's consent, they could never do it. It's that simple.
Absolutely. And this IPCC, these summary reports that they put out, I've read them all up to I think it's the AR5, which was the one that came out in 2014.
Yeah, the latest one.
Yeah, they're relying on that for this Paris conference. But if you go back to 2007, the report says global emissions of greenhouse gases will rise by between 25% and 90% between the year 2000 and 2030. With fossil fuels still being a main source of energy through to 2030 and beyond. So they're just totally contradicting themselves.
And not only that, if you look at there are two macro and micro, recent and long-term accepted graphs from ice cores and various other proxy methods from the past, which do not show a relationship between CO2 and temperature. And the longer you go back, right to the ice ages, there was a point where there was a huge peak of CO2, and we were in an ice age, because the precession of the Earth, where it wobbles and tilts away into the sun, and we have these regular ice ages when we're further away from the sun and pointing against it, so the winters get much colder and never stop in the summer. So you've got this huge ice going all the way down to London, which is where it goes to from the Arctic. These happen regularly, and we are the very lucky people, because according to all the historians, you only get problems when it gets too cold. When it gets warm, nobody has problems, because they cannot attribute any extreme weather, wet, cold, drought, anything else to global warming, because I've checked up and all the studies either don't know or they disagree, but they don't say that in the media. They're all unanimous. We're all going to die. It's worse than terrorism. They're helping the terrorists because they're diverting attention from real crimes and avoidable things to something natural which can't happen in our lifetimes. So they're fooling people twice over that, and it's a disgrace.
Yeah, it's for simple minds, really. It's very cleverly done, and it works on a lot of different levels. Hopefully we'll touch on some of those levels tonight. But let's just talk about this, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change not being in any way a scientific body.
No.
This is from Christian Gerondu's book, Climate Liars. It says, the truth is that the central structure that manages the IPCC, its bureau, is comprised almost entirely of people who are not climate experts at all, and who knew nothing about the subject. The chair from 2002 to 2015, Indian-born Rajendra Pakori, was a railways engineer. Of his three vice chairs, Sudanese-born Ismail El Ghazuli has a master's in operational research, and Korean-born Ho-Sung Lee is a specialist in the economics of energy. They are, in fact, apparatchiks in one of these things the UN knows all about. none of the three has any qualifications in climate issues, and the same goes for most of the 31 members of the Bureau, more than half of whom also come from countries that have not a single climatologist. And it goes on. But what I find really amazing is that we were talking about this militancy that people have. I encountered this at this little meetup, and I was talking about a lot of different things, global civilization, ancient cultures. We got onto this subject, and two people immediately started attacking me and saying, but all this was known, that the Industrial Revolution would cause this. There were papers written 100 years ago on it. And I was thinking, but what's that projection got to do with it? Because they didn't know anything about the intricacies of the subject. And I think that's where it's very, very clever, because it's a simple solution for simple minds, isn't it?
Yeah, well, the great thing is that you've got correlation and causation. Now, the funny thing is that the real hockey sticks in the 20th century were commodity prices. They did actually peak. If you look at just about gold, oil, which is the exception since then, because it's gone down. But then again, the temperature stopped rising as well. So maybe they are closer. But all these things have gone up. But the interesting thing, which is connected with CO2, is that since the CO2 went up, the economy has grown, the population has grown, and the most important of all, our lifespans have grown. So the only time the CO2 emission ever went down was a few years ago when we had the world recession, because CO2 production goes with prosperity. And if you reduce CO2, you reduce population, you reduce prosperity, and you reduce lifespan, because they go up as it goes up. So if you force it down, it's going to go down. Simple.
That's exactly right. And the people who set up the Committee for Geoethics, which is part of the Paris Climate Challenge, it kind of came out of that. People like Niels Axel Morner, the guy we had on last week, who used to actually produce stuff for the IPCC, and then at some point they started using just models.
Yeah.
And they weren't using experts anymore, and they just came to this consensus. But they wrote a letter to Ban Ki-moon in 2009, and they would just asked him specifically, we challenged supporters of the hypothesis of dangerous human-caused climate change to demonstrate that, and there's 10 questions, that variations in global climate in the last 100 years are significantly outside the natural range experienced in previous centuries. 2, humanity's emissions of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases are having a dangerous impact on global climate. 3, the computer-based models can meaningfully replicate the impact of all of the natural factors that may significantly influence climate. 4, sea levels are rising dangerously at a rate that has accelerated with increasing human greenhouse gas emissions, thereby threatening small islands and coastal communities. And that was something that Niels Axel Morner was an expert on, the Maldives. And this kind of idea that they were all sinking, you know, because the ocean was rising. But actually, so it's not as simple as that. And there are very good explanations as to why some of those islands, which are built on coral, and when they're built on, actually do start sinking, you know.
That's right.
But, he said, sea levels are rising dangerously at a rate that has accelerated with increasing greenhouse gas emissions, thereby threatening small islands and coastal communities. That deals with that one. The incidences of malaria and other infectious diseases are now increasing due to recent climate changes. Now, that's a new one they brought in, isn't it? The malaria.
Yeah, the malaria is interesting because, you know, it's so easy now with the internet. You don't have to go to the library and make inquiries. You look it up. Malaria isn't even temperature related. It is dirt related. So if you have these filthy swamps, I think we used to have malaria in Europe as well, but because we cleaned things up, I'm not an expert on endemic illnesses, but I'm pretty sure that malaria is not really temperature related, because if they spent the money they spent on solar panels draining the swamps in Africa, they wouldn't have malaria in Africa because there'd be nowhere for them to breed. So again, it's an avoidable problem. Even on mosquito nets would prevent a lot of it, but they don't do it. And why not?
Yeah, the sixth question is that, whether human society and natural ecosystems cannot adapt to foreseeable climate change as they have done in the past.
Well, yeah.
Yes, we'll just go through them anyway. This 7 worldwide glacier retreat and sea ice melting in polar regions is unusual and related to increase in human greenhouse gas emissions, that polar bears and other Arctic and Antarctic wildlife were unable to adapt to anticipated local climate change effects, independent of the causes of those dangers. 9. Hurricanes, other tropical cyclones and associated extreme weather events are increasing in severity and frequency. 10. Data recorded by ground-based stations are a reliable indicator of global surface temperature trends. Now, they all signed that and sent it to Ban Ki-moon, and of course, there was no response whatsoever.
Of course not. Well, I mean, I pick this apart every day. I'm in the climate change discussion on Facebook, which is one of the busiest groups. So you wanted my website, so I just remembered that. informationrevolution.blogspot.co.uk is my main information site, so you'll find it all there. Information Revolution is also on the Facebook, where I post it all and we can discuss it and people can add to it. If somebody writes something relevant, I'll add it to my blog as well. And Twitter, I'm at David A. Howard, so people can tweet me there and follow me there, and I go through all the links. But we pick apart these things. So every day I get this Twitter feed and this climate feed of people who are making these marvellous claims which sound absolutely terrifying. And 9 times out of 10, I don't even need to do the research to pick them apart because I've done it already. And they're just inventing things. So the latest extremes with the floods we had in northern England and anything else, that's right, the extreme temperature for 2015. If you actually go back to history, firstly, they're saying since records began. When did the records begin? Probably in 1979, because if you're using satellites, they didn't have satellites before 1979. As for floods, they're making it up because the floods themselves were worse in 1929 in Britain because it's on a regular cycle from El Nino, and they even said that on the radio yesterday with a climate expert. So, but the media and the politicians who have an agenda to push will use anything they possibly can, because people don't stop and think. They'll buy shares when they're falling, and they'll do these crazy things because they don't know better. Where as I always say about credit cards, no person working for a bank would dream of having a credit card. So if the people in the know realise that something isn't worth having, I can just imagine all the IPCC people having solar panels on their roof. Can you imagine them buying £8,000 worth of energy in the hope in advance that over 20 years that they might get it back? So the insiders have actually scratched the surface. They know what's going on underneath and they are not fooled. But people have got this terrible defence mechanism by fear, where their lower mind kicks in. Oh my God, my grandchildren that don't even exist yet are going to die. And suddenly that's more important to them than actually having their poor granny in her flat paying a pension, freezing from hypothermia or dying from starvation because she can't afford to keep the heating on. I mean, you wouldn't believe it if it wasn't true, would you?
Well, this is it. But I mean, you're up against a brick wall with some of these people, because one guy was saying to me, yes, but even if what you're saying is true, and I said it is true, you can see the documentation, he said, even if it's true, we have to do something about climate change.
Yes, well, that's the amazing thing, because it's not a problem. It's just the same as going to the doctor and having an operation where you don't need it. You are cutting your body open and removing an organ that's healthy, and you're going to have a scar and be missing an organ, and you get nothing back in return. And these people are quite, programmed. The way I've seen it recently in the last few years is that it's like there are people like one of these films like V or The Invaders, where people are either immune or unaffected by a mental program which descends on the weak like a cloud over the whole world, and those who are tuned in will pick up this mental virus, and they're all speaking for the same one Borg mind. Because when I go on Twitter, when you get these people coming in with their friends on Twitter, you get these Twitter storms where you say something controversial to somebody who's a real activist, and all their friends come in and slag you off for an hour, and they all say the same things, and you can actually predict what they're going to say. Then they block you and call you the same names. I see it as an infection. They've all been possessed by the spirit of global warming or social justice or all these nonsensical things, and they all talk as a person who's just sharing one mind together, and it is frightening. But the good news is that as a hypnotist, you snap your fingers and they wake up. It's just a matter of finding a way to wake them up, and then they'll wake up and say, "What happened there? Where have I been for the last 10 years?" because underneath they're normal. You know, they're just ordinary people who have been affected by somebody else's program. That's the way I see it.
Yeah, exactly. It's a mind virus, and it needs to be broken down. We're going to take a break now, maybe for
Okay.
6 or 7 minutes, because we haven't had a break yet. So we'll get Tony to play a couple of tunes back to back, and when we come back, we're going to talk about how social policy has implemented this and how it's filtered down into the community and the results of that filtering down and what we're seeing now, which is basically a takeover by change agents, people who have come in to enforce this global agenda. So we'll see you in a couple of minutes. had a bit of the church there, and then we had Jason and the Stork, and finished with a bit of Brian Wilson. So we're now back. We're talking about the global control system which is being imposed on us by the UN at local level through Italy, which is Council for Sustainable Development. I'm talking to David Howard, and we've just talked about how this was set up in the background of it really is the environmental movement. And we've also talked about the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is implementing these policies through your local council, which everyone should now be aware of. We're now going to go into a little bit of the background of social policy and think tanks and how this is being implemented through government into local authorities. So welcome back, David.
Hello. Yes, you're a bit muffled there, but I can just about understand you. But I'm keeping up.
Okay. All right. I'll try and get near to this microphone.
Yeah, that's a bit better.
Is that better?
That's a lot better. Yeah. I can understand you now. Yeah, you were very bubbly before, like underwater.
Right. Okay. That's fine. Yeah, I think we've got a bit of yes. That's better. Yeah.
That's nice now. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, we've got a nicer level now. That's always good. Yeah. So really, this comes down to social policy think tanks. How this is being put into local authorities by the UN. And this is where a lot of people go, the UN, what's they got to do with it?
Yes.
Well, this is a global action plan implemented locally. And this is all about the control and micromanagement of your life. In other words, what they call the New World Order. Now, there's a guy called Bill Cooper, who did a show called The Power Hour. And his prophecies are quite chilling because he said about 15 years ago that there was a global government being built by the UN and they were going to micromanage your lives. He died in quite suspicious circumstances, but he had his finger on the pulse as far as all this stuff goes and what they call the New World Order. So, David, the background of all this, it filters down to organisations such as the Tavistock Institute. Are you familiar with them?
Yeah, well, only from what I've seen from you, but the thing about this is that you've got non-governmental policy organisations who basically, like the Fabian Society, this goes back for 100 years. You've got, the Volkisch movement was the precursor to Nazism, which basically put the planet ahead of the people. Green movement, Volkisch is the German land movement, where the land was the most important, the people who worked on the land, and what they managed to conflate there was the people working on the land with the land itself. So it became a nationalistic thing. So you ended up with only the people that were born on that land had the right to be on it. So that was how the clearing the land for the Aryan race began, and that developed your two branches, the Nazism and the Green movement. Now, if they knew that their original movement went back to the Nazi Party and most of Greenpeace's policies were developed in pre-First World War Germany, they might think again about, if the seeds and the roots of the tree are in rotten filth, then probably their own policies are in rotten filth. And every action that they've taken to restrict fossil fuels and to restrict travel and ordinary everyday people going about their business, all the pain, all these policies that they're cooking up behind the scenes are hurting real people immediately. Every time you get a law about anything to do with the environment, the costs and the actual losses are immediate and quantifiable, and there are no known benefits ever. How many people have ever benefited from having a road closed? And how many ambulances have ever benefited from going over road humps at 20 miles an hour because they can't get to the hospital in time? Just look at the consequences rather than the policies, and you'll see that nobody would ever accept those policies without the fear of ruining the environment. It's all a con.
That's absolutely true, David, and that takes us into what I was going to talk about, how these are things that we're going to locally. But if we talk about, for instance, the Tavistock Institute, very, very interesting book by Dr. John Coleman, who also wrote a book about the Committee of 300 and how the Tavistock was set up to basically get public consensus into the First and Second World Wars. In other words, to create the enemy, and they're still doing that. Now the enemy is the climate. Of course, we've got what's happening in the Middle East, which is it's all part of a bigger plan. It's all part of a business. This is all part of a global action plan, really. implemented locally. So the wars and what's happening really about the stripping of assets from countries is just a part of it. But it's very interesting that the Tavistock Institute is now in the same building as the British Psychological Society, the Academy of Social Sciences, and the Political Studies Association of Great Britain. Now, all these are social policy organisations, and all this filters down into things like policy exchange and demos. And I've seen demos in action and what they do. They're very clever operators, but these people are not playing in any way in a fair kind of manner, because what they have is a policy and a way that they want to implement that policy, and nothing is off the charts. So they use extremely devious underhand techniques, and these filter down into your local council meetings. So all of these policy organisations are really using things like Delphi technique, which everyone should be aware of. Delphi technique is a way of gaining public consensus. So in other words, everybody in the room appears to agree, and we first came across this at the Occupy movement, how that was taken down. Occupy St. Paul's was taken down by no more than 5 people who turned it into climate change, all backed by George Soros. Climate Camp Action with basically an organisation which is alleged stole the money from Occupy St. Paul's, but they turned it again into a green agenda. So we find that all these associations and policy makers, really, policy makers and stakeholders, this is another thing we hear a lot of, stakeholders, which are basically organisations, companies that are profiting from carbon tax, green taxation, stealing of property, etc. And this is being played out in London on a massive scale. The face of London has been totally and utterly changed in the past 5 years. And it's not just these Crossrail that's stripped out the heart of London. The whole infrastructure and the way that people see London has changed. For instance, all of these small businesses, these wacky places that used to make London fun, are all disappearing, and we're getting this homogenised corporate takeover. Really, it is a takeover of everything. Every single thing has been taken over, and all individuality has been squeezed out. And this is all part of this global agenda known as Agenda 21 under the United Nations. So, having seen how this operates, it's very important to get across how devious it really is, because this is the problem that a lot of the Guardian readers and the people who are consider themselves still to be in some way upwardly mobile, they have a big problem with this, don't they, David?
Yeah, well, the thing is that if you hide it under good intentions, the devil is always your saviour, because you hide the truth, you hide the lies in a truth sandwich. So what you do is you start off by giving people free stuff and offering them the earth, get their trust, and then stab them in the back. It's the oldest story. It goes right back to the beginning of the Old Testament onwards with Satan and the wolf in sheep's clothing, and it's never changed, because every generation the same damn formula works, because our bodies might be evolving but our minds are still the same as when we were almost in the Stone Age. And they exploit it. Goebbels exploited it. He created all the psychological rules, and after the war they used Edward Bernays picked it up as public relations. So we have public relations now, which is basically making people believe something that they wouldn't have believed. So if you want people to buy a load of junk, just tell them that this load of junk will make you popular, and you'll get more women, or be able to last longer in bed, and people will buy it even if it does nothing at all, because it's their belief which is stronger than their common sense. And people exploit it. I mean, Derren Brown and Paul McKenna are entertainers who tell people that they are genuine entertainers, and they're doing this to entertain you. They're not lying to you. They're just being entertainers. There's a peeping going on. I hope we're all right. And but you can exploit any power. So if you exploit this power of hypnosis and hypnotize people to believe what you want, hypnotize them to hand over all their money because your cause is so important. People are going to die if you don't hand over your money. Oh, is that peeping at my end or your end? Never mind, it's nothing to do with me.
I'm not quite sure, actually. I'll find out, man.
Yeah, don't worry. As long as you can hear me, I'll ignore it.
Yeah.
Anyway, so you can convince people just about anything. It's exploiting good people. It's exploiting people's minds and it's exploiting people's weaknesses. And the thing is that it puts them against the good people who aren't affected by it, and the good people simply say, no, this isn't true, people are being hurt now, and your good intentions are not actually helping anybody, because your good intentions are leading to very bad policies, and they won't hear a word said about it, and they'll call you a murderer because you're going to kill their grandchildren that haven't been born yet. And they are thinking completely with their lower brain, because what you're doing is you're activating the survival mechanism. And when you do that, the intelligence goes out of the window, and the enemy have won. But it's always reversible, and it can always go back.
Yeah,
I think there's something outside my house. It's typical, isn't it?
Yeah, it's the psychological subversion. It's this is what I find fascinating about it all: the rebranding and repackaging of language, and find this consensus language, sustainability, and all the rest of it. Buzzwords that we know about, there's loads of them. When you look at a council document, diversity, and
it's all neologisms. That was part of it. I'm just going in the other room. You talk for a minute. I think it might be something in the other room.
All right, Dave.
Now.
Well,
Stop now.
Whatever you've got in your oven there, you take that out.
Yeah, I think it was the alarm clock. I think the alarm clock went off without the slightest bit of provocation. But it's gone now. Isn't that good time? It's never done that before.
We need a global alarm clock.
That's right. Yeah. Oh, these things are sent as little messages to people. Wake up, everyone! The alarm's going off. Listen to us. So even the alarm clock's working with us tonight. It's part of the programme. Isn't that funny?
Well, it is. I've been travelling around the last few days and looking at beautiful parts of the country, in Kent at the moment. And so I've been using 2 laptops. The battery just died. It's very impromptu, but we're broadcasting here from a camper van, which is great. Even at this time of year, I'd recommend it to anybody. Bracing is probably the word for the weather. But it goes to show that there hasn't been any global warming for nearly 20 years. I can actually prove that.
Yeah. And the interesting thing about the global warming is that anybody who actually tracks the science, this is why you don't need to be a scientist to do this, because the scientists work out what causes the CO2 to be a greenhouse gas in the first place, and learn about back radiation and Hadley cells and all this stuff, which is interesting to know, but it's not essential. And what you'll get is revisions of the proxy temperatures, where they are measuring temperatures in areas that previously had no thermometers. So if you've got a thermometer, the thermometer never lies unless it's been misadjusted, like some of the NASA ones. That's another story for later. But it's the first time ever that the UN last year, or the NOAA, the American Meteorological Society, changed their own direct temperature mechanisms, and all the measurements they picked up from their own thermometers had been changed to suddenly create this little uptick. But there are 4 basic world temperature graphs, and this one disagreed with the RSS, remote sensing systems, and disagreed with the satellites. So the bottom line is that if you are a doctor or a builder or an engineer or an accountant, and you get 3 different people giving you totally different figures for the same house, or for the same patient, or for the same business, are they all wrong? Are they all right? And they can't all be right. So which one is right? It's like playing Find a Lady. It's a shell game. They're taking the mickey, because anyone with sense can see if you're using 3 different temperature graphs and none of them are the same, how do we know which one's right? It's all a joke. How can people believe such nonsense? It's amazing, really.
Well, it is, and it goes into this latest report by the IPCC, which was highlighted the Paris Climate Challenge by several speakers, including Christopher Monks and Piers Corbyn.
Yes. Did you cut off there, or were you saying something and went dead?
I was saying something. Did it go dead?
Yes, it did. You said Piers Corbyn, and then we had silence, but you're back again. Keep going.
Well, there's never silence when Piers Corbyn's around.
I know. I'm
very vocal about what he thinks, and he was actually very vocal with a lot of the other speakers there, and had many questions. And it's people like him who are at the forefront of all this, challenging it. There's only a few people challenging it. Monckton's very good.
Yes.
Piers Corbyn. The real scientists like Niels Axel-Morner and Bob Carter. There's a whole list of them. You can go to windowsontheworld.net or pcc15.org
and you'll find the videos there. Just go on YouTube, the Paris Climate Challenge. Donna Laframboise, the journalist, interviewed her. She's been exposing the lies of this organisation called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And it's not a scientific body for years, but we're just really talking about this social policy and what's happening, how it's being implemented. And what I found was there's these change agent groups being set up within communities. And somebody put in a chat box a few minutes ago about Edward G. Bernays, of course.
Yes, that's what I mentioned, yeah.
Absolutely, and he does tie into the Tavistock Institute. If you read Dr. John Coleman's book on that, and of course he's been vilified by it. Not this very well nonsense. It's not a propaganda arm at all. Well, of course it is, but we've got worse now because we have loads of little propaganda organisations all working on the same piece of propaganda. This global government, which is being enforced locally, and the results of that are everywhere to be seen in London now. These organisations like UN Unlimited, Intentionality, Citizens UK, there's loads of them. You've got Community Organisers Limited. Community Organisers Limited. Now, these are people who are being mentored. Now, this is very important. They're being mentored by a mentor of one of these organisations. So in other words, they're being led into the Agenda 21 policies, and only those people who are suitable to be used by these organisations are going to be used. And that's a very important thing also, that what we're seeing is this creation of these mini hubs everywhere. And it might be a community centre, and then you start noticing the logos of Unlimited, Intentionality, Community Organisers, Citizens UK, Locality. You start seeing their logos appearing, but often without them disclosing it. And that's a very sinister aspect to this, because if you think like, okay, we're going to train all these community organisers, then you would think that there's nothing wrong with that. What's wrong with community organisers? But these people aren't community organisers because they're not part of the community. They're brought in as change agents to take over public opinion, which is exactly what happened in Waltham Forest with the mini Holland schemes, which were implemented with money from Transport for London. And when this scheme was being piloted, it was basically to what you were saying earlier, Dave, to close off as many roads as possible, and on the back of cycling. Now, nobody wants to cycle around this place called Walthamstow, but there's nowhere to cycle to. If you want to cycle, you'd be going outwards on the Lee Bridge Road and maybe up to Epping. You wouldn't be cycling around a little suburban area where there's nowhere to go. Once you pass the old post box and the rebuilt 15th century house, there is nothing there apart from 2 restaurants and a couple of shops. So this idea that it's about cycling, people fell for it. And what they very cleverly did was recruited cycling groups. And they also created their own cycling groups and gave themselves awards. This is the local council. They gave themselves awards. They even had a dinner for the people who were at the awards, and if the public wanted to go, it was £175 a ticket or 1,500 quid a table. Now, when all this happened, one of the guys who was manning the barricades of the so-called pilot to this scheme, where they weren't letting traffic in or out, and they closed all the roads off without telling anybody, said, well, my boss at Transport for London said it's 65% in favour. Of course, that was made up. There's been no public consultation. You can find that in an article called Big Society Change Agents, which has loads of video links on windowsontheworld.net, including, I think, some of the interviews we've done, David.
Yeah.
But the way this has been implemented is truly shocking, and now I'm hearing about it in different boroughs. Now, this in Waltham Forest, it's going to be 3 of these villages, and it's already creating traffic chaos. Now, in California, there's a video where this guy's describing what your local sustainability community is going to be about. It's going to be about you stranded in a high-density area with bikes, cafes, and no cars. But outside of that area, it's going to be traffic chaos. And the chaos is there for a reason, because there has to be a solution to the chaos. The solution to the chaos is to get rid of all the cars. So it's about banning cars. And we know that Paris is going to ban cars. It might be a little way ahead in other parts of the world, but it's certainly happening very, very fast. So people have to look out for what's happening in their local area. Because these people are like a virus. They are everywhere.
Yeah.
And underneath what they're doing, there is even more sinister aspects to this, which I don't think we've got time to go into today, but we'll do in the future. And it really goes down to social programming, especially of children. That's a very big issue of what they need to keep this thing going. Of course, kids can do their GCSEs in climate change now and all the rest of it. But it goes a lot deeper than that. So how have you seen this playing out in your area, David? Because I've already gone into this. People can look at my stuff on winnersontheworld.net, Mini Holland schemes, and UN destroys London. I've gone into this and I've shown people how this is being implemented, what's happening. So you're in an area of North London. What's happening around your way? How can you see this being implemented?
Well, the amazing thing is that when you see symptoms, you don't realise what the cause is until somebody says, this is the cause, this is why you're getting weird things happening, because it's been planned. So what we've got from my bedroom now, there are lots of cranes and tower blocks, and all the way up the Edgware Road, the A5 going to Edgware from West End and Broadway, you're getting these huge tower blocks going up. Smart Cities Agenda 21. The difference in China to England is that in China they have no human rights. They are building these huge cities in China and then moving people there from the rural areas, because people in China have no say where they live. If the government want to shift people 500 miles from the rural areas to the cities, they just do it. They don't do it here. What they do here is that they invite loads and loads of immigrants in, 350,000 last year, which is the world record for Britain, certainly the all-time record for Britain. That's under a Conservative government, not even a Labour government, so they are in practice exactly the same when it comes to the bottom line, because the EU tell us what to do and we've got very little say in it, and it's happening right across Europe now. So we're getting all these skyscrapers going up and they've got these terrible laws. Now, my father was a civil servant at a level where you know things, so in the past you could not build anything without parking, adequate parking. So what's happening is now they're building things without parking because they don't want people to drive there. So you're getting a council estate in West End and 600 people being demolished. They're putting up tower blocks for 3,000 people on the same land. Sewage, water, doctors, schools, and probably over half the people don't even have English as their first language. I mean, talk about a recipe for chaos. They are turning the London Borough of Barnet and Brent into Brazil, Mexico City, Pyongyang, all these places that we would dread. If we lived there, we'd be refugees trying to get out of the war between North Korea and South Korea and being shot. And they're doing it so slowly and insidiously, but you wait for a doctor's appointment or a dentist appointment now, even compared to 10 or 15 years ago, and you wait 5 times as long. And you go to the waiting rooms a lot of the time and you'll see that everywhere's crowded. I mean, our local community hospital, which lost its A&E along with just about every other one, they've got a walk-in centre, and you walk in and you'll see the crowds of people and waiting, and 4 hours later, if you're lucky, a few of them will have been seen. This is a new development, and it doesn't represent just the London Borough of Brent and Barnet. It's just spreading from the boroughs to a town near you very soon, and it's going to be the same everywhere because it's directed from the UN. So it's not London, it's not Britain, it's not Europe, it's wherever you happen to be. We're just the first, we're the test. It's getting worse.
That's absolutely right. The breakdown's happening everywhere. Another friend of mine in North London gave me exactly that story, saying that these tiny little places being built without any parking spaces. And of course, a big part of this is to break down the culture, any cultural reference. We were talking about this earlier on, the destruction of culture that's going on everywhere. So, how to do that? Multiculturalism, diversity.
Yeah.
I mean, this is insidious stuff, and most people are getting their heads around it now. But it's really very, very clever on many, many levels. And once you start getting it, you start getting it properly. And it's not about one issue; it's about many issues. And all this stuff about the Mini Holland that I've been talking about, so the Mini Holland scheme, this is a great microcosm for what it's all about. It's all done without public consultation, and the people who voted for it now hate it. The people who wanted to overturn unlawful decisions with closing roads without public consultation, consultations should take at least 5 years. They were just brought in. And now you've got ambulances who can't get to people, who are finding that the roads are cut off. They don't know how to get in or out of where they're going to. And you've got traffic chaos outside that. And yes, they are introducing lots of different immigration, lots of different immigrants into the area, break that down even more. And a big part of this, because I speak to a lot of people in America, is to actually create confrontation and problems. So the problem reaction solution thing is to bring in different people, set them against each other. We've all heard that the Third World War will be between Muslims and Christians, and so Albert Pike stuff. But really, this all ties into it because it's all coming through. So what we're finding is that the North Europeans are being pretty much decimated, and we're going to be flooded by immigrants, which is now they're making this a big issue because they need to create this racism as well. So they foment that, and the whole thing is very, very simple. If you were a manipulator when you were looking at this, you go, yeah, this is it, easy. These people fall for it time and time again, and they're not organised, and that's the big problem. Small groups of people may get organised, but there's never any consistency. So when you've got something as big as the United Nations, none of this is a problem. The only way I can see a solution is for people to physically start ripping down these road closures and these big planters that are being put everywhere and reclaim their streets, and that's something that the so-called civilized people aren't inclined to do because they're too sheepish, basically. But I think that all of this is built in. There was a quote by Unlimited in 2010, and I've linked to this. It was said in Parliament, and it was to do with Unlimited, a change agent group who mentor people for your local community, all for your own good, of course, that the result of the cuts will be one of anger, the degree of which is yet to be realised. The idea of the big society is to galvanise that anger before it takes hold. Now that is an incredibly creepy statement because we're seeing the results of that now. And there's many, many, many thousands of these change agents, and they run your local council. They pretty much run every decision that's being made locally to you. So the only way people can really do anything about this is get to be aware of that fact that your local authority have no say in this. And this came up in Walthamstow because people go, well, it's these councillors. No, nothing to do with councillors, nothing to do with the dopey MPs who know nothing about this. They're not going to help because they will not address the issue. And this is the main thing. It's that elephant in the room, which is Agenda 21. And nobody can see it because they haven't been told it's there. But it's the results of the policies are all around. So it's really about people, I think, forming small groups. How do you think we can fight back against this, David?
It's very simple. What happened with me is I saw what you call the big picture. I saw lots of separate things happening, put them all together and saw how all of it fitted in. Now, when anything new happens, I fit it in. And it works. So the awareness, nobody actually has to see the whole big picture, just to listen to people who have and say, well, look, this guy has actually done their research, knows the system, and I've got no personal interest, no oil companies pay me, I'm not a right-wing extremist or any of the other things I've been accused of. I'm just somebody who likes the truth and fights for the truth and has been educated to both go through the system and investigate properly and communicate it, because my job was being a teacher of law and politics. So all I'm doing is exactly the same as I was doing at school. I'm teaching people facts which they can verify themselves. So, if I get something wrong, I'll admit I've got it wrong, but 99% of what I tell them, you can check it up because I've got it from reliable sources, or just do the arithmetic and put things together. So the awareness is crucial, because if 20%, I've heard, of the general public hear about something and realise that you scratch the surface of shiny, bright stuff and there's only poo underneath, you are dealing with poo. What do you do with poo? You throw it out. And what do you do with the people that fed you poo, telling you that it was birthday cake? You kick them up the backside and put them in prison. That is the key. Understanding what's actually being given to us is hurting us, and that everything fits together. So every apparently random policy of all these immigrants coming in suddenly from the third world into Europe. Why are they going to Europe? There are plenty of safe places in Africa and Asia, but they're all coming to Europe, and a lot of them are coming not just into the safe, prosperous parts of Europe, which are like paradise compared to Eritrea or wherever they've been, or Somalia, but they're queuing and killing themselves trying to get to England. Not just safe Europe. There's got to be somebody planning all this, and then you've got all these road closures and other things. They're not all different, unconnected things where people are suffering. They are all designed by one group of people at the top. You could call them the Club of Rome, the Rockefellers, the Bilderbergs. They all work together. They plan this behind the scenes, behind the government. They employ Obama to put it all in place. If you heard his State of the Union address last night, all about climate change and Muslims. Now, the two things we are talking about is climate change being used to control people and Islamic terrorists being used to create fear and division. And Obama is behind all this because he's justifying the whole lot. And for him to say that climate change is worse than terrorism, you tell that to somebody who's just been lost their family by a suicide bomber. I mean, how can people accept this blatant nonsense when it doesn't make any sense? If you saw this on a film as an objective viewer, you'd reject it immediately, but people accept it when it's reality. It just shows how easily you can bypass people's reason, get completely round the back of their common sense and go straight to the lower brain. And the thing is that you can't keep them like that forever, because what you're doing is you're pushing down their common sense. And, if you push something down long enough, the pressure will build up and it will blow up, and all the stuff will hit the other people in the face and wipe them out. And that's what's going to happen. They can't keep it up forever. All about
That's
awareness.
absolutely right. And that's already happening. They've already predicted that there's going to be huge social unrest.
Yes.
That last statement that I made in 2010 was quite unlimited. So basically, these people were put into place to cover up social unrest. But also, I wanted to get onto something else, which is these people, the people we're talking about, the so-called, what I call change agents, because that's what they are, and they work in the private and public sector, trained in the public and private sector, and they're running everything at a local level for you. And this is where people have to get their heads around, your MP's not going to do anything, councils don't do anything, they bring their own people in, the planning officer for somebody in Holland reported from outside, the cabinet member for the environment, Clyde Lowe, reported from Northampton years ago, he's a useful idiot with policy. And it's something that you're thinking, is this going to end up with just a few intellectuals in the last remaining pub, because there aren't going to be any left? There might be one remaining pub with a debating society once a month, would those people who went up there become the new Illuminati and turn it all around? It's it's very discouraging when you've got something that is so well orchestrated on such a mass level and the public are not at all aware of it. It's incredibly difficult to break that one down. I mean, you can end up worn out trying to persuade people. I just put some documents in front of me usually and see if they actually bother to look at them. But I think it's going to come down to people standing up for their individual rights, which is quite interesting because that's what happened to a certain extent with this so-called free man on the land movement, which we all looked at. And there were certain aspects within that make you look at the law and how the law works and what your position is within the so-called society you live in, what all that's about. So I think a lot of it's about examining who you are and what you are to the World Bank, to the World Bank or the IMF, because as we know, the IMF is an agency of the United Nations, and the World Bank and the Bank for Economic Development and Reconstruction, these are all tied in to how this is being implemented. Because really, it's just a few financial control scam. And a friend of mine was working at a Goldman Sachs event where they were openly talking about putting the gas pipelines in across Syria to provide Russia of revenue. So all this stuff is planned. We know what happened in Libya, the Tartars before they went in. You know, it's all corporate, and what we're seeing is the results of this, in that the corporatization goes into every level. So you've got these people who are coming into the community who are just corporates and using Delphi techniques, which everybody should look up, because if you go to a public meeting, every single one of them is held by Delphi technique, and it's a way of controlling what's happening and bringing forth your own agenda. And they have a facilitator and a co-facilitator. This lady in California, called Deborah Tavares, who's exposed this. It's a great video called Who's Running America and the Path. That's really, really worth it. It's really worth watching, because we have the same things here. All of these little websites that we set up, the climate action plan websites, every borough's got one, and it tells you what the temperature is in the local borough, what the weather is, and also everything you need to know about global warming.
Yes, I mean, global warming really is the shibboleth, because I always test politicians, because, you know, I don't believe many of the politicians start off by being bad. You get, with all crimes, you get the ringleaders and the followers and the opposition. And the politicians, you get a few ringleaders who know the score. But if any of the politicians mention global warming, I don't care whether they believe it or not, they're my enemy, and I don't want anything to do with them. And it's a dead giveaway, because I know it's not true, certainly as in it's not going to hurt anybody, and that the single policies, you never pay more for something than it's worth, and you never actually do anything, excuse me, I'll close the door, you never actually do anything where the treatment is worse than the cure. So you don't cut somebody's leg off to slow them down and things like that. You are actually cutting people's legs off now, or taking a car wheel off to make it drive more slowly, which is what road humps are, a cancer on the road. Now, the truth itself is stronger than everything, and we always have the truth on our side. So I always say to people, don't get disillusioned, because when you get to a point where you're on your own against this crowd of people, they're all wrong. You and the truth beat everybody else that's wrong, because if you've got a dark room where there's no truth, you shine the light and all you see is what's in that room. So they'll tell you the room is full of CO2, which is going to make it heat up and kill everything in the oceans and the ecosystem and flood the world. And you switch on the light and you see the world is doing exactly what it's always done. And there are 5 times more polar bears now than there were in the 70s. And polar bears can live on ice or on water, and they survived when there was no ice at all, because there's been more time in history with no polar ice outside the ice ages than there ever was with polar ice. And you find out the truth, and you can't ever change that, because you can cover up the truth, but you can't get rid of it. And in the end, the truth will always surface.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I mean, the poor things, you know, all of their homes are melting and they're drowning. You know, I mean, but these are just massive scavengers. I mean, you live in a location where you've got polar bears, you mean, your bins ripped apart, and they're just invading your privacy all the time. Of course, when they're drowning on a piece of ice, this brings us all back to this fake environmentalism. It's like, you know, Patrick Moore, you know, he said, here's me with stopping the seal cull, you know, but this is why I left Greenpeace, because it was taken over, and now they're basically telling you that we've got to depopulate the planet, and the carbon dioxide is going to kill us all. You know, it is insanity. I think there's an awful lot of in-jokes with this, because I think they push people to see how stupid they really are. And they are. The CO2 thing. And loads of people are falling for it, and they're very worthy about it. You just think, have you really looked into this? And I think that's the key. People actually, how all this works is that people aren't, they're just not competent enough to deal with their own affairs. And this is how the whole system of law has worked over 50,000 years. The lack of competency of the general public, and people not knowing what their estate is, what their liability is. And this does come into it, because a lot of this is about theft of rights and property. And it's on the back of something which is a guilt trip. It's very, very comparable to what the Vatican were doing. You know, with the papal bulls of the 1300s, they were saying, you know, that they were the authority under God, and there was no authority under God apart from them. And this is what the UN is. It's a global action plan on the back of a lie, which is going to take over every aspect of your life. But again, we go back to the idea of like, how do you get that across to people at a local council meeting? That this is a UN thing. I think it's starting to sink in. I think, though, that people are genuinely horrified in these areas. They're actually starting to get a bit scared, because I talked to a group who was set up to fight this in Walthamstow, and they thought they were playing on a level field. They actually thought that their input would make a difference. The court case that they brought, which was actually held in private, public weren't even allowed in. And this is a public issue. They took a barrister on who was totally sticked them up, and he was going on about one point of law which had nothing to do with what this was about, which was unlawfully closing off roads and access. And of course, they wasted their time and their energy and their money, and that's what happened. They exhaust people, and they give them an idea that they might have a chance of fighting the consensus, and of course they haven't. But I think it's down to individuals. I mean, take the low emission zone.
Mm.
You referred to that earlier, David.
Yeah.
An older vehicle, which I have, take off the front number plate when you drive into London, because the camera's only photograph that. That's not legal advice, by the way.
No.
Doing it. But these are tiny solutions often make a big difference, don't they?
Yeah, well, the thing is, it's about open doors and revolutions. What you're talking about are sort of civil action, revolutions, civil disobedience, and what I'm talking about is open political and legal doors. So, for example, the EU was never legally binding. We could leave immediately. The door was open, so people are not ever in prison. North Korea, they're in prison. In Cuba, they're in prison. But in Europe, none of us are still in prison. And all over Europe, there is a party in just about every country where if you vote for them, they will take you out of the EU, because a vote for them is a vote to leave the EU. Did anyone vote for them? No, they didn't. They got about one seat. Now, that is madness. Now, Greece is the best example of all of how people are so silly that what they'll do is they will take anything rather than change. So in Greece, they pulled their plonker to the most extreme level, and it's so extreme. I'm sitting here saying this is an entire country, and they've been fooled 3 times. Fool me once and it's your fault. Fool me twice and it's my fault. They've been fooled 3 times. They got this Syriza government in, who said that we won't accept the bailout. Then they tried to not accept the bailout, then they accepted the bailout, then they said we'll have a vote whether we'll accept the next bailout. Everyone, 61% voted we don't want the bailout. A week later they did it anyway, and then he said, well, I don't want to feel like I've cheated the people by going against their vote, so we'll have an election. And Syriza got the same number of votes almost as they did before, after shafting their people. Now, if we're dealing with people, which you've got to have a double-digit IQ to go through that, to be fooled 3 times and still vote for the same thing, that the evil that rather than any uncertainty. And God forbid the whole world. We've got the tipping point, the false imaginary tipping point with CO2, climate, and with leaving the EU and the euro, which people are imagining literally that their world will collapse and the whole system will die if they either leave the EU or the temperature goes above 2 or 3 degrees centigrade, which can't happen in our lifetimes because all the projections make it physically impossible based on past data. But the people would rather vote for being in a pile of manure than what's over the other side of the horizon, which got to be better than living in manure. But because we don't know what's there, we'll stay in the manure. And that is human collective hysteria and madness. But people will learn. You can't hear people like me forever and deny what we're saying, because there's none of it which can't be verified. It's all about verifying. If you can verify what somebody's saying and check it up for yourself and find out that if you have the same opportunities to discover the information that they do, and none of it requires a level of academic knowledge, that's the thing about silencing people, that they first said that unless you're a scientist you can't have an opinion on climate change, and then when 200 or 300 scientists with PhDs came out and said climate change is bull, oh no, they're not climatologists. Well, let me tell you something, climatologists didn't exist until the 90s, they were meteorologists. The UN, the IPCC invented climatologists, as a brand new system to fool the public. They are Harry Potter with a wizard with a a magic wand, waving the magic round and saying, look, I'm going to create a cloud over there and a rainstorm over there and a tornado, and they were going to happen anyway. But because you say that you're causing it, people think, wow, he can control the weather, but they're just meteorological. It's like betting on a horse where you already know the results. They're cheating you. They're using old tricks, old propaganda tricks, and the most basic childhood magic tricks that children learn when they're first learning to be magicians, and fooling people like the Greek public financially and scientifically. But it can't last forever, because you can't fool people forever if there are people like us telling them the truth, because they've got to assimilate it in the end. Just a matter of patience and persistence.
Well, exactly, and it's all very contradictory when you look at so-called fossil fuels, oil, coal, and natural gas. I mean, they benefit from a whole range of subsidies that is huge, and this is remarkable. But yet, this is been by the IPCC. The whole thing's totally contradictory, and we now know why that is and what is going on. But it's happening very, very fast now, so nobody can really escape it. So the policies of this high density housing, the surveillance communities, the banning of cars. I was saying this a year ago, this is not about cycling, it's about banning cars. The local authority going, how much more cycling do you want? Well, as much as they want to have, but what's that got to do with banning cars?
Exactly.
And the way that North East London's been changed so radically within a couple of years is shocking. And this is marching forward really quickly now. London's not the same place as it was 15 years ago. It's changed radically. And the restrictions on the travel and, closing all the ticket offices, all contactless. There's control with everything. They're doing it with cabs. Wherever you want to go is going to be monitored and controlled. But it's just apart from the kind of sinister aspect, it's just the inconvenience of it all and the kind of restriction on your freedom, because part of the fun of being alive is being able to travel, in my opinion. And the whole way society is here, you won't be able to do that. And there are people who will fit into that quite easily. It's very interesting how they kind of recruited a lot of these 30-somethings who are very naive, and they're very pro-cycling and anti-car. So it's very, very carefully thought out, as we've been saying, but I think that it's going to take quite a few informed people in these areas to get together and do something about it. We're starting to see the beginnings of that in North East London, because people have been shut down and they're genuinely in shock about what's happened. They've just been put into a elaborate atmosphere, really. They've turned somewhere that was quite a pleasant place into a ghost town, which is completely surveilled. You can't get in and out of. And of course, it's the social cleansing of the elderly. So that really comes into it. And a lot of these people, funnily enough, who are being social cleansed out of these areas aren't really that old. They're just not really paying as much tax as the young yuppies,
Yeah, the thing is, it's the old story that if politicians say they're going to help you, it's the wolf in sheep's clothing. If they're going to help you, they're going to castrate you. So you've got these TfL adverts on radio, on LBC the whole time saying we're going to modernise and improve your roads. Now, modernising and improving roads where you lived and where I live involves narrowing them, bringing in cycle lanes and bus lanes, and causing hold-ups which go further and further back the longer you do it. Because if you block one bit of road in London, you can get tailbacks going back 4 or 5 miles on a good day in the rush hour.
That's exactly what they've done.
Yeah. So all these improvements are nonsense. I woke up in 1976, I think, because I was riding a little moped, and we got this letter through the door saying Barnet Borough, where I lived till 93, was bringing in bus lanes. You've heard this story before, but the new listeners won't have done. And course, as a 16-year-old, it's all new to you. So you see it's bus lanes. Oh, wow, the buses are going to have their own road, so we won't be bothered by buses. So all they did was they cut the road in half, and only half of it could be used by traffic, and the rest was empty, except for the odd time when a bus went past. And where I live now, all the traffic queues up for a half a mile in the rush hour to get out of the bus lane, which includes buses, for 200 yards of bus lane, for a mile's tailback of everyone waiting to get through the bus lane, including the bus. So if you didn't have the bus lane, the bus would have gone 10 times faster anyway. So all these so-called improvements, the best people, if you want to know about London roads, are my friends. I've got two of my best friends are taxi drivers. And if you drive down Fleet Street now, or Westminster Bridge Road, you will see that there are various major thoroughfares in central London which have been narrowed or closed so much that it's almost impossible to drive through. And forget the congestion charge. The whole point about the congestion charge was to charge people for what they're already paying road tax for and charge them again. And Zach Goldsmith, who is a Conservative, not a Labour or Liberal, but Conservative, standing for London Mayor in May, wants to have a congestion charge through the whole of London because, again, his UN credentials, he must be working for Soros because no sensible person would ever do this in their life. He is more concerned about CO2 than he is about the people in London being able to get around their ordinary business. So can you imagine where everyone in London has to think before, can I afford this journey? It'll be like China when only the Communist Party members could afford to drive, because in the end, just like comprehensive education, the only people that can afford the good stuff are the rich and the elite, and everyone else will have to stay at home and watch X Factor or play with a computer because they can only drive, very selective times because the rest of the time they simply can't afford it. And it's turning us
there now. I mean, I tried to get up to Harrow a few weeks ago, 3 hours, but Harrow is gridlocked, absolutely gridlocked. It's pointless even trying to drive there.
Yeah, it's getting worse then.
And the North Circular Road Improvement Scheme, the North Circular Road around London, which is enclosed within the M25, that improvement scheme, again, what you're saying, narrow the roads.
Narrow the roads, yeah.
Dates from the 1950s, where there was hardly any traffic on the road. Go and look at some of those old movies, where the British films with people going around them on motorbikes, There's nobody on that road. It's empty most of the time. And of course, they've not done anything to widen it, so they've narrowed it. So people there thought, these houses are all going to be knocked down. But that didn't happen. They actually narrowed the road. They made the pavements bigger. That's a big thing as well about the Agenda 21. Yeah. You should start seeing massive pavements everywhere that are just far too big.
Yeah. And the funny thing is, where they've actually built cycle lanes and wide pavements where they've got these blue signs up saying cycles are allowed to go on them, 90% of the cycles still go on the road because they either don't realise it or they don't care. And they still get in the way of the traffic. So, the cyclists are free to go on the pavements or free to go on the cycle lanes all over Kingston and Richmond, for example, and all around the North Circular, because most of that now get them on the pavements, but loads of them still use the road. So these cyclists apparently would rather take their chances with the lorries than use their own cycle lanes anyway. And I'm sure the buses, the drivers say, we don't care whether we're held up or not. We get paid for a day's work, whether we're moving or not. So if they're sitting in a queue for 15 minutes to get to their bus lane, and all the people are being late for their appointments, and somebody's got a hospital appointment and misses their X-ray because the bus was late, who cares? They're not concerned about people's everyday life. And the bottom line for government is we are paying them to work for us, to do the things we can't do ourselves. So if you've got a government you voted for who are closing hospitals and closing A&E wards and making you wait longer for your hospital appointments, doctor's appointments, dentist appointments, and filling your schools with people that don't speak English and bumping up the classes from 30 to 40 people in a class because they can't build a school in time and they can't train enough teachers in time. And if they did bring in more teachers, they wouldn't have English as a first language. So you'd have the blind or the deaf leading the blind and the deaf. So there is no solution. You can't build houses fast enough for 350,000 people a year. And you've got people camping out from Romania and Bulgaria all over central London and under motorway flyovers because they've got nowhere to live and they would rather stay here because their life apparently is still better here doing these work on building sites and things if they can get it, and living under motorway bridges, they had a programme on it, than going back to their own countries, which is diabolical, really, because also we've got the brain drain where all the talent and doctors and dentists come over from Eastern Europe and the third world to work in England because they get paid better. They lose all their own doctors and dentists, and you're going to get towns there with nobody under the age of 60 because they've all come to Europe. So they are ruining their own countries, stopping developing countries.
Dave. I know two people have gone. One went to Turkey to get his teeth fixed. The other went to Budapest.
Yeah.
But this is another thing about that's a slight side issue. But yeah, that's another thing that really annoys me. You have to go to the hospital, then you risk getting a bloody parking ticket now as well.
Exactly. I mean, really, the things we took for granted in the 60s and 70s, which I'm old enough to remember, most of it has gone out the window now. I mean, I live in the suburbs. When I was a van driver in 1980 onwards, I used to ask them for all the suburban work so that I could keep moving. I didn't have to sit in all the traffic and I could find my way around without one-way streets. Now, I'm not doing that now. I live right on the edge of the North Circular into the suburbs, and you can go anywhere north, i.e. out of London, Monday to Friday, working times, and it'll be gridlocked 50% of the time anywhere in North London, because 50% of it is there's more people driving, so there are more people generally, and 50% of it is that they cause these awful snarl-ups where you can have red lights which are on 2 or 3 times longer than they need to be, and you've got a little bit of a road there where they're doing road works and it's moving everyone up, and they've closed that cut through there. Now, roads are actually not rat runs, they are roads designed for people to get from A to B. Now, if you put in road humps, 50% of the time people will have to drive slower, and 50% of the time people will drive a different route to avoid them because it damages their car and ruins the journey. All you're doing there
really hurts if you've got a broken arm or a broken leg.
Exactly. The emergency vehicles use them. Now, I've said this on our last interview. The Borough of Barnet, where I lived, published in the Hendon Times figures for a year, something like 1991 or 92, all the people that had died or suffered from fire engines and ambulances not getting to people in time because they had to slow down for road humps. And we've put in road humps to save people getting killed from cars. We don't know how many more people have been saved by it, but we do know that 10 people died last year because the ambulances couldn't get to them in time or get them to the hospital in time because they had to drive at 20 miles an hour instead of 50 miles an hour because they were allowed to do it. So, like exactly the same as global warming policies, we know every person, they've got a fund in every council in London for people who have damaged their cars on road humps, and they have to pay out for exhausts and undercarriages and suspension and everything, which they don't even question because they know that if you go over a road hump at 15, 20 miles an hour on a 30 mile an hour road, if your car hits it at a certain angle, it'll take a lump off the bottom of your car and they'll pay you out because they can see it. They can't argue with it. And they're willing to do that, as I say, to have a treatment which is infinitely worse than any possible benefit. And of course, there's no benefit from reducing the journey, the quality of the journey from A to B, because all the emergency vehicles and public services and public transport, because they've got humps on bus routes now, they're all going to use them and suffer the same way. No benefit from it at all. It's just like introducing cancer. And I'll just give you one quick example of how selfish some people are. Now, forget about whether you agree with Trident or not. It doesn't matter. But the point was the GMB leader yesterday on the radio said we must keep Trident, not because anything to do with we need it in a war and to defend people, because that's the separate argument which is totally separate from this. It's because we'll lose jobs from it. So I thought, well, in that case, millions of people are employed in pharmaceuticals, giving chemotherapy and radiotherapy for cancer, and antiretrovirals for possibly 40 or 50 years of people's lives to slow down the HIV multiplication. And if they found a cure for cancer and HIV, it would put them out of work, but it would also make loads of people well again and save lives and everything. And what the GMB is saying, we would rather waste billions on Trident, which we're probably never going to use. And if we did use it, it would wipe out half the world. But what about the jobs? I mean, talk about selfish. It's the opposite of utilitarianism. Instead of them trying to help the majority of people, that the other people can always get other jobs. They don't have to be working. When they've had tobacco factories going down because people don't smoke so much, they've diversified into other things. They don't go out of business. But that is the mentality we've got running us, corporate fascism, where the companies and the banks, whatever it is, the unions, the big guys are squashing the small guys because they're only interested in themselves at our expense. And that GMB
That's very true about the unions, David, because they've been totally infiltrated and taken over by the change agents I've been talking about earlier on. Steve Headley, who's very much involved and still is with the RMT union, very decent chap. We had him on the show. Several things about the use of biometric scanners for the poorest workers on London Underground by ISS, which is obviously going to be rolled out. The tube train drivers wouldn't take it. They wouldn't take it. Another poorest immigrants will. And of course, then it's going to be rolled out. We know what's happening in London Underground. It's turning into basically, it's to get in and out of there, you're going to have a microchip sooner or later.
Oh, goodness, yeah.
They put the price of the tickets up 3 times. So to buy a ticket now is 3 times more expensive than using the Oyster card. And of course, we're going to get the Oyster cards. All this is coming up, but it's maybe a good excuse for people getting out of London. More and more people seem to be doing it. It's a bit of a shame it's come to this, that capital city is now just lab rats, really. But with the funny thing you just mentioned about road humps, everything that you said is true about that. Several years ago, we did a little video for Road Hump Day with a guy called Peter Colley on it. If you want a bit of a laugh, go to YouTube. He went around Hounslow measuring road humps, found people. Not that this had any effect, but it's an incredibly amusing little video. And some of the guys with these lowered Mercedes, avant-gardes that are lowered, they just ruined their cars going over this one.
Oh, yeah. Any speed will do it. Yeah.
You just hear that crack as they go over.
Right.
Oh, my God, But we know what it's about. It creates more pollution anyway.
Of course it does.
It's all nonsense, the whole idea of this traffic calming. I mean, I really love the reversal of language. It's called traffic calming.
Yeah. That does everything. But, I mean, the safest roads in the world are motorways. So the faster you go, the more smooth the journey is, the less chance there is of an accident. Accidents are caused by lack of concentration and people at junctions and people fiddling with the things in the car and not looking at what's going on in the road. Now, it doesn't matter how fast you're going, the whole proof of this, because as a lawyer you always look for good examples, that outside London you've got these lovely twisty country roads with 1 or 2 lanes that go from 1 to 2 lanes round a bend and you don't even know it. Do you know what the maximum speed on them is? 60 miles an hour. In London you've got these roads where you can see and they're straight and they're wide, relatively wide, and you can drive through them after 7 or 8 o'clock at night without any traffic, and they were 30 miles an hour. Now a lot of them are 20 miles an hour. Now the thing is that nobody on the 60 mile an hour country roads where you've got a road which is a lovely main road and it's 60 miles an hour and you branch off into a narrow road, twisty road, 1 lane, still 60 miles an hour, people are not going to kill themselves, so they drive slowly. So 90% of people will drive at a safe speed for the road. They don't need to be told what speed to go because they drive at whichever speed is good for them, because they will be the ones that suffer if they have an accident. And it's exploiting the good side of the selfish principle that most drivers are more interested in coming home safe, not hurting themselves or having an accident, so they will protect you because they don't want themselves to be hurt. So the speed limits are all nonsense, really, because people drive at a safe speed where they're driving on the same road at 30, 20 or 50 because it's the road conditions, and the country roads prove it. Because just because you can drive at 60 doesn't mean everyone does drive at 60, because they drive safely because they know how to drive. Got to have your freedom. You don't need to be told what to do. They're not ruling us, they are working for us. People got to remember that.
That's very true. Yeah, they are public servants, these people, and the UN really are the global governance. They are a bank, they are an agenda, and they really are not fit to be running our lives. I'm just going to go into this thing with the Vatican getting on board, because now we have the religion of climate change, global warming.
Yes.
So it's a religion,
that.
and this is what it was set up as in the first place. Gaia, we are a blight on the face of the earth. quite extraordinary. There's the most extraordinary scientific advances, the most amazing technical abilities, the most astonishing economic growth. Unless they are accompanied by authentic social and moral progress, will definitely turn against man. This is the Vatican speech, you know. This is this is what they laid on the world, you know, at the UN. And it says the natural environment has been gravely damaged by our irresponsible behaviour. The misuse of creation begins when we see nothing else but ourselves. Each of us must repent of the ways we have harmed the planet and acknowledge our contribution, smaller or greater, to the disfigurement and destruction of creation. Well, in my view, that should be put as a prosecution of Ban Ki-moon. Put it to him, because that's exactly what they've done to the planet.
Yeah. Well, we are guilty for living because everything that emits CO2 is exhaling. We exhale goodness knows what percentage, about 100 times more CO2 than is in the atmosphere, as do animals, which is why they want to get rid of eating meat, because herds of animals emit CO2 every time they breathe out. So they reduce the food for us. And what they're actually describing is aspects of human living, that if we eat and we drink, so we need water, and that produces CO2 to produce clean water, and heat the houses produces CO2, so we mustn't be at the right temperature, which we have to be for our health. So all the things which are not through choice, which we can't avoid, but are essential for human life, eating, drinking and heating, they want to stop. And then the final thing, which is slightly optional but blooming inconvenient if we don't do it, is travelling. So they're stopping our basic human requirements, our essentials, because they're making essentials too expensive. So we've got to have the house at 70 plus degrees, otherwise our immune system starts getting weak and we start catching everything that's going, because it's using all our energy to heat our bodies from inside, and we become malnourished. It's making food more expensive by burning biofuels, which is food, because they're burning corn and they're burning all sorts of food oils, which we can't eat because they're reducing the food supply. So everything they're doing against global warming is directly against our natural requirements for life. So that speaks for itself, really, doesn't it?
Well, it absolutely does. And this is what's so clever about it. It's just a big reversal. But I think this another really funny comment from the Vatican here. It says, changes in climate affect the livelihood of the poor, who are then forced to leave their homes with great uncertainty for their future and that of their children. Well, that's Agenda 21 in a nutshell.
Exactly.
It's getting everybody off the land.
Exactly.
So they're not joking when they say that, because it's exactly what they're doing.
Yeah.
You know,
I mean,
it's very interesting reading this, because it's almost like it is a big joke on the population of the planet. You know.
Yeah, well, they've been clearing huge areas in Africa for biofuel, and these poor farmers who are actually growing crops have been turfed off their land, and they've had missionaries from Greenpeace going out there volunteering to help the UN officers get these guys off the villages they've been in for thousands or hundreds of years. And they're starving now because they're losing their livelihoods. So the very people they're pretending to help, they're wiping out. And of course the population is reducing now there, because they're struggling to get food, because they used to grow their own crops and sell the spare, and they can't do it now. And that's all directly from the Greenpeace. And the UN have now said biofuels are bad for the economy, bad for the food supply. Not one country has changed its laws on biofuel, even though the UN have said it's bad things. So it shows where their hearts really are, and they're not interested in us. They're more interested in the biofuel.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And it says, just to cap it all off with another thing we now know is a complete lie as we round the show up, many of the world's coral reefs are already barren or in a state of constant decline. Absolutely. Yeah. We found out the Paris Climate Challenge, because the real experts know that is not true.
Of course not.
So we're being fed a barrel full of lies, and we have to do something about it. Do it at local level, because I think that's where it matters. It's the global action plan implemented locally. And it would come down to small groups of people standing up for their rights and getting rid of these change agents. And as we know, they have the money and the power, but we have the truth. This has been Windows on the World. And I'd just like to thank my guest, David Howard. Where can we find your stuff, David?
HTTP, no W's on it, Inform Revolution, INFORM revolution.blogspot.co.uk. Facebook, Information Revolution, Twitter, David A. Howard, all one word. And if you've got anything else you want to find out, ask me there and I can put you on the subsidiary sites. But the Blogspot links with 2 other blogs that I've got. But that's the one that covers all these things anyway.
Well, thanks, David. We had quite a lively discussion there, and hopefully we've given people a bit of insight into things that they might not have known about, even though that the average listener, if there is such a thing as people with internet radio, knows a lot of this stuff. We have to do something about it, and we have to do something about it individually and stand up for our individual rights. And of course, the people who listen to this radio station will be probably well up for doing that. So thanks for listening, everybody. This has been Windows on the World, and we'll see you very soon.